Working Cows Podcast, episode 159.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. It's Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows Podcast, powered by the Global Ag Network. And y'all, I just got to tell you, I have the greatest audience in the history of podcast audiences, I'm pretty sure. So really thankful for everybody who's supported the show throughout all these years, coming up on 3 years of doing this podcast. Most recently, I received one of the most desired pieces of podcast equipment of the last couple of years, the Rodecaster Pro. A very generous listener went out to my Amazon wish list and bought that there. So thank you guys so much. Really cool Patreon supporters and all that. Patreon has just released the opportunity to support yearly. So if you are interested in supporting the Working Cows Podcast, you can do that 1 year at a time and sign up there. So if that works better for you, go ahead and do that. Patreon.com/workingcows. Workingcows.net/support is where you can find all that. Enough of that. We're going to talk today to Nicole Masters about what are weeds saying to us? How do we hear what they're saying? How do we understand what they're communicating? Yeah, I know. All the cage stage keyboard warriors in the regenerative agriculture group will tell you they're not weeds. If they're green and growing and something will eat them, they're not weeds. I get that. But how do we understand what they're telling us about what's going on beneath the surface? And I'm really excited to talk to Nicole Masters about that today. Nicole, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows Podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, Clay. It's always fun to talk with you.
I was working on a project and listening to a podcast as I do, and I was listening to Charlie Arnott's Regenerative Journey podcast, and he was interviewing Charlie Massey, and I don't remember what sparked the thought, but I was thinking about what do we do with weeds, I guess, as we like to say in regenerative agriculture. That would be in quotations, but I think if it's green and growing, it's an opportunity for something to eat it. If we'll find the right animal or the right stock density, they'll probably at least experiment with it. So first of all, I guess that's kind of what I would like to start off with is maybe reorienting our perspective around some of the species that we refer to as weeds, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, and I think it's a good thing to define from the start, because I mean, really, for me, weed is just an easy word to use. But what I think of as weeds is, I mean, all plants can be weeds in any setting. It is what are they trying to tell me? What are the indicators? What is it? You'll see certain types of trees and certain types of soil types, or you'll see certain species maybe by a stream, and it's like, what are the conditions that set the signal for germination for these different species? And so I think if we start to reframe how we look at what we see growing and make it a process of inquiry in terms of, this is interesting, I'm seeing more of these types of species, and maybe it's this type of grass, or maybe it's these type of broadleaf spiky things that maybe you don't want so much that the livestock aren't eating. But starting that inquiry is what regenerative agriculture is all about. And
some of the things that they might be telling us are the way the soil is balanced. Is that right? I mean, that some of if we've got this kind of plant growing, it might be an indication of higher fungal levels, and if we've got this kind of plant growing, it's an indication of more bacteria. Is that right?
Yeah, so I think of it in terms of 6 different signals and reasons for why species might germinate. So first of all, if we have bare ground, so we're going to have those bare ground colonizers that very quickly get in. Or it could be that we have low organic matter, and that's not anybody who's listening to this podcast. It might be to open up compacted soils. It might be in response to mineral availability or imbalances. It might be a microbial imbalance. And it could lastly be a safety valve for toxins. And for me, that's been some of the most interesting weeds that I'm coming across are these safety valve ones.
Interesting. And like you said, the bare ground or the low organic matter, the bare ground maybe isn't an issue. Obviously, it's always our neighbor's place, right?
yeah. Not us.
But so the 6 signals, could you run through those again?
So bare ground, it could be low organic matter, it could be compacted soils, and actually compacted soils tie into all of those other things. So we have compacted soils because of, maybe it's bare ground. And so the 4th one would be mineral imbalances, the 5th one's microbial imbalances, and the last one is a safety valve for toxins. So that's in my book. I got a whole chapter on weeds, so people can look that up. But so it's starting to ask those questions. So, some of these weeds are what we call the dynamic accumulators, which are your mineral imbalance ones. And that's where we will actually take like leaf tissue tests. So send them off to a laboratory and see what is that plant very high in. And often you'll find if you sample a grass next to it, the grass might be deficient in it. It might be molybdenum. It might be boron. And so those are the ones that are telling us that it's a mineral imbalance. Sometimes we'll test a plant and we don't really see that. And then when we look at the microbial signature, it's very much a microbial indicator as opposed to a mineral indicator. So we're kind of using all of our testing and also just our observations. I mean, you can tell is a soil bacterial or fungal dominated by your soil structure and how it smells, but also what obviously is growing above ground. So there is like a plant successional process that will happen biologically. So think of your very primitive soils, your very bacterial soils. Then we're going to get your early colonizers like cheatgrass, so very shallow root systems. They actually feed specific bacteria. They keep it very primitive. They throw out a lot of seeds. I think of those as the bacterial dominated species. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have our fungal weed species, and these often, think of mullein, henbane, those big, broad-leafed, invasive kind of weed species. Often they're ones that animals don't really want to eat, or they are like your more woody weeds, like your briars or your buckbrush or your rabbit brush or even your sagebrush. These, in certain ways could, some people might see them as weeds. It's like seeing pine trees or gum trees in a at what point is that a weed? But it's all like, what is this trying to tell me? Because the seed bank in your soil is absolutely massive. And it's not because your neighbor's allowing their thistles to seed and then blow over to you that you've got thistles. It's about what is the signal that you are sending? And we send those signals through our grazing management or our overgrazing management. And also you got to think we have a historic loading in terms of what's happened to our soils in terms of you're not dealing with some kind of pristine resource. You're often dealing with 120 years potentially of set stocking or overgrazing or pasture sizes that are too large and having all your mineral and microbial ratios are out of whack. And so sometimes we are having to do something like it might require more than just your grazing management. And that's hard sometimes for people that think you can solve everything with grazing. But I've been on properties that have been doing fantastic holistic grazing management for over 30 years, and we're still seeing major trace element breakdowns, which then means we're not getting our rooting systems down, and we're starting to see weeds come in after 30 or 40 years. And it's like, all right, something needs to shift or shift another gear because it might have been working so well so far, but actually, where do we need to adapt? Where do we need to be add some flexibility?
And so one of the ways, and I don't think anything's original necessarily. There's nothing new under the sun. But one of the ways you hear people talk about it is that weeds are nature's cover crop. Is that a good understanding in your mind? Yeah,
I think so. And she was on a ranch where I am right now, and we talked about they're going through a healing crisis. And, as you start to change your management, often we can see a flush of potassium, and that will actually, because your potassium is bound inside plates in the clay. And as we flocculate or open a soil up, because you're improving your grazing management, we can actually see a flush of some of these broadleaf weeds like thistles. And that's just part of that healing process. Now, plants don't necessarily work on the same time frames as we do. So some of these dynamic accumulators, they might be bringing up copper. They could be doing that for the next 50 to 100 years. And I'm just not that patient. So I can't, yes, the weeds can do it. Actually, nature, all of nature can do it. We just need to get out of the way. But looking to, is this just a temporary kind of flush, or I'm losing production and it's affecting animal performance?
Right, and what are some of the ways to determine whether or not it's temporary or if it's something kind of bigger picture issue? Yeah,
and I think that's where you need to look at what those species are specifically. So if we look at ventinata, Medusa head, cheatgrass, knapweed, these ones that people are really getting pretty upset about and seeing encroachment, rapid encroachment. Now, if you look at what they're doing biologically, they're pretty gnarly plants in terms of they are changing the microbial community to keep it in stasis. Like they feed, like if you think of knapweed, it feeds archaea, which are the most primitive organisms in the soil. It also feeds out what we call monosaccharides, so your most simple sugars, and what they feed is diseases. And they don't feed like your more advanced species. They don't feed... There's these organisms called entomopathogenic fungi, which are your fungi that eat insects. They don't feed on the monosaccharides. So what that knapweed does is it just keeps it real primitive, keeps the conditions for itself, and excludes other plant species. So the successional process stalls. And same with those other types of grasses. So we actually need to come in and we need to interrupt that violently, and that might be with heavy animal impact, manure and urine, or bale grazing, or the use of some of the biostimulants or something. I don't think that fire would help you in that case, just thinking about it, because I think that still keeps it in that bacterial zone, but something that's going to really feed your more advanced species. So we've got some trial work here in Montana that hopefully we'll have the results next year with ventinata grass. But looking at, if we're feeding more advanced fungi and more beneficial organisms, do we interrupt that germination signal? Because they're just annuals, those grasses anyway. So we should be able to interrupt it. But what we're seeing now is the increased encroachment of these species. And part of it too, if you dig up their root systems, they have pathetic little roots. Like the fact that breeding is just amazing, but they're really taking advantage of overgrazing, or not having your deep-rooted perennials in there, because if you had deep-rooted perennials, they would actually outcompete and grow inside those root systems and do those plants out of a job. But because, they are doing such a powerful job feeding primitive organisms, we have to interrupt it. And that's why it's like every plant's trying to tell you something different or has a different signature. So learning to, what is it trying to tell me, and then how can I maybe just push it along?
Yeah, and so I guess kind of what comes to my mind is maybe the idea of talking a young producer maybe off the ledge. They're like, oh, okay, the only way that I can solve this is through some kind of a chemical approach. And so I guess you've mentioned heavy impact, and I know that every situation is different in some of those things, heavy impact or bale grazing. Could you run through some of those ways that we should approach, maybe even the different, we come in, we see these plant species and this mix of species telling us this. What are some of the ways that we should approach those from a management perspective?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's starting to note, where are we seeing this encroachment? One of the things I like to use is a refractometer, so measuring the bricks, and that actually gives us an insight to who's photosynthesizing the highest. So is your management more suited to this weedy species than it is to the species you're trying to grow? And so it can be very insightful. So if I see that I'm changing my management, maybe you do get a flush of a thistle, just as an example, and then you go out and measure the bricks and you see that the thistle has a lower photosynthesis than the grasses, it's on its way out. And so it helps kind of give you more confidence to just leave it alone. It's just going through that healing crisis, that transition, and it's not here for the long term. Whereas if you find its Brix might be 2 or 3 times as high as the grasses, it's settling in. Yeah. And then we really need to look at, that more aggressiveness. If people are using herbicides, and I'm not a massive fan of them, but there are things that we can do. So if we take this leaf tissue test and we see that this plant is high in boron, and molybdenum, we could put that in with our herbicides, and we could also put in a fulvic acid, which is going to help to increase your herbicide efficacy. And then we're going to get trace elements into the system. And so then we're addressing the underlying driver for why we have those species. And so then you're not going to have to come back and repeat, because most people are spraying a herbicide and then they're having to come back and spray another herbicide. It's not like the herbicide's the one-hit wonder. And that the fulvic acid doesn't work with all herbicides, of course. So just make sure you test, do a spray test. Yeah, and this is, I think, where our adaptiveness is and our science on the ground as ranchers is, in terms of, really trying some of these different ideas in terms of how big an impact do I need, and what were the weather conditions when I did that, because maybe you did a really heavy impact and it rained and you created this cow patch and now suddenly you got thistles everywhere. So just having that observation in terms of what was it that was happening in this area when I grazed here last time that I'm now seeing these species. Yeah.
And do you look at herbicides as a break glass in case of emergency type of a use case, or is there? How do you think about that?
Oh, I like it. Yeah. Yes, but in saying that, I've never used a herbicide in my life. But I work with producers who, and especially like in cropping, I feel like in ranching, no, because we can do things. It just probably depends on the scale of your operation. And I've worked with some people down in Nevada, the 370,000 acres, 80% of it's burnt at one point and they're covered in cheatgrass. And it's like, okay, so where do we start focusing our energy? And at least having some ground cover is better than no ground cover, and that's the risk with herbicide, is you're potentially going to make a situation worse. But looking at, let's concentrate on the areas where we can really lift performance and production. And if that starts around the barns, and then we gradually move outwards until hopefully we can get that grazing management on all 370,000 acres. But just really, really trying to concentrate where you can make an impact instead of spreading our resources really thin and, potentially being out there spraying all the time. But yeah, I think if you're going to be investing in spraying, then invest in something that's going to help repair. So yeah, trace elements and carbon foods. Yeah.
Sure. And is that, those are kind of along the lines of, inoculants or different kinds of more natural ideas or products?
Yeah. So more complex foods. I think a lot of the time, I think of most of American rangeland as just being sleepy. And also, don't get offended, but constipated. So we have these hugely constipated soils that they have so much mineral in them, and yet we're not seeing that necessarily come through into the plants. And so by using complex foods, and what that means is they might have fats and sugars and proteins and all sorts of things in it. So they are naturally sourced. I do like using fish hydrolysate, but I find in this country your fish hydrolysate is quite smelly, and that can put people off. In New Zealand, our fish hydrolysate is made differently, and it just doesn't, it's not as stinky. But yeah, things like a little bit of seaweed, or I actually train people in making their own biostimulants or making their own chelated minerals, so that instead of something like, if you commercially brought it, it costs you $50 an acre, it costs you $1. And so I kind of like things like that, like just put, power back into ranchers' hands, make it very economic. So the biggest cost really is getting something out, if you needed to get something out. A lot of what I see out there too is a lot of rangeland is very deficient in sodium, and people probably think, oh, but we've got these alkali patches or whatever. And it's because that sodium's come off the rangeland and concentrated down in valley floors or eastern Montana or whatever. And we see a benefit by using things like sea minerals or some of the more mineralized salts is something that we might use to wake that soil up if it's sort of gone to sleep. But yeah, there's lots of different tools in our toolkit, I guess, beyond necessarily just grazing, or, doing things like putting seed through cows so that we, if you are using heavy animal impact, why not put some of those perennial seeds in the mix if you're not seeing them coming away through your management. So I think just realizing that there's more tools that we can use.
You mentioned chelated minerals and sea minerals and some of those things. Is there a benefit to running those through a cow, or is the application going to be, out of a spray unit of some kind?
We do see some of the trace elements coming through for cattle, but things like salt doesn't, because those animals need it. But yeah, we've seen zinc, for instance, lifting in the New Zealand context, where they use a lot of zinc to control a disease called facial eczema. We're seeing zinc levels actually get really high in soil. So it is possible to lift it through animals, but you need to be feeding it to them, not just, not just a little bit that they need for their own maintenance. Yeah, I want to share a story I went down to see Betsy Ross at Betsy Ross Grass Fed.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I've heard of her. She's been suggested.
Oh, you should chat with her. She's a firecracker.
Yeah,
but she does a similar process in what I do in terms of leaf testing weeds, and she did a leaf testing on mesquite and found that the mesquite was very high in some trace elements. She made up a brew that had the fulvic acid and trace elements, and she applied this to the mesquite. And within 3 weeks, the cambrium layer on the trunks all cracked open. And you can go there, and 3 years later, like, she's got these huge old mesquite trees that are dead, but all the grass around it's come away. So that idea of, even reading trees as weeds, I know some people are dealing with conifers and, those kind of species. Take a look. What are they trying to tell you?
And you ran through those signals, the 6 signals, and the last one that you mentioned, you said was kind of one that is fairly exciting to you right now. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so these release valve weeds. So as many of you know, nitrates or nitrites in the environment, microbes don't like it. We don't like it. Livestock don't like it. So if we were to drink water that was high in nitrates, then, like in Australia, they've had blue baby syndromes, and babies have actually died from drinking the water in Perth because of the high nitrates. So it robs oxygen out of your blood, which then, that's going to be linked to being cancer causing as well. But so nitrates in the environment, most microbes, or nitrites. So there are specific plants that have adapted to pull this out and convert it. And so those are things like our foxtail barley grass, our nettles, our thistles, our kochia, fat hen, red root pigweed. I never know sometimes how people, common names can be different. But think of these are the weeds that you're going to see around the edge of yards, or maybe where animals have been camping under trees where you've got a whole lot of manure, excess nitrates. And so they're really interesting ones to take a look at. Do you start to see an advancement of those kind of species? Then that's telling you that your microbial, like the chain to convert that to ammonia forms, is broken down, and then we get that signal, and these weeds will basically germinate. It's also telling us that we're low in your predators in the soil, so your protozoa and your nematodes, because they stop that bust and boom cycle that's happening with bacteria that's causing this flush of nitrates, if that's not too complicated, sorry. I love it, I geek out on it. But these cycles occur in the soil, and then we get this flush, and basically those weeds will germinate. So if you start to see foxtail barley coming in, take a look. Foxtail can also be indicating sodium. So you need to go, is it encroaching because actually I'm starting to create sodic or alkali conditions, or is it because I'm missing the predators, or I've got low organic matter? But some other ones I got really interested in was milk thistle or variegated thistle, and seeing this around where people were drenching animals. Like, so they might have like a sacrifice field where they put animals after they drench them, and seeing this weed turn up. And some of these ones that are chemicals or toxins can be quite gnarly. Like, well, you guys don't have Bathurst burr, but some of the Australian ones are pretty evil looking plants, because everything in Australia wants to kill you, obviously. So you got these crazy, gnarly weeds that are telling you that potentially there's heavy metals in the system. So milk thistle, the first time I saw it was in this coulee, gulch, gully, whatever you want to call it. And it wasn't anywhere else on the farm. And I said to the farmer, what's happening there? And he said, oh, it's an old dump, and we put some batteries in there. And so the batteries were leaking, and this milk thistle was basically germinating to help break it down, which is cool. So that this is the phytoremediation. And then I saw it in the San Andreas fault line on properties that were doing a pretty good job with their grazing, yet they were getting more and more of this milk thistle. And then when you look at what's happening on the San Andreas fault line, and we saw it in New Zealand after the 2010
Christchurch earthquake. Is that right?
Christchurch earthquake. And it's the funniest thing. I was sitting on the plane next to this. She was a nuclear physicist or something. Like, just as you sit next to people on the plane, or in the old days before COVID.
Right.
And she said to me, well, what happens is deeper down there's uranium. So when these plates start to grind, then they release radon gas. And so wherever we saw this release of radon gas, and if you look at places around California, the big hotspots of radon, but also of milk thistle. And then what interested me is, like, milk thistle is what we use for humans to do a liver detox. And so here you've got these plants that are basically doing a liver detox on the land. And so I'm like, wow, that is so cool. So yeah, getting really interested in how, some of this phytoremediation is what these plants are trying to do. Maybe you do have a buildup of a heavy metal, and especially once we degrade our organic matter levels, then your plants now have no protection against heavy metals or sodium or whatever. So we're going to see the encroachment of more and more and more of these types of species, unfortunately.
Kind of the next direction I want to go is, how do we determine the best time of year to attack these species? Is it through tissue testing? Is it through bricks testing? Is it all of the above? What are some of the tools that we can use from observation to help us determine the best time of the year to add impact, and what that impact should be?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If I can pull you up on the use of the word attack, though. Okay.
Sure. Go ahead.
Oh, you weren't thinking attacking plants. You're thinking, how do we attack the problem?
Right. Yes.
Oh, got it. That's right. Certainly bricks, leaf tissue test, when the plants are actively growing. So if they've already, senesced and are browning off, then you've kind of missed your window. Like, especially with bricks, you want sap, obviously. And then we want it when the biology is really working well. So I did a study recently in the Tom Minor Basin, which is on the edge of Yellowstone National Park. They have the highest numbers of predators in the lower 48. So these guys have high numbers of resident bears, and they're all grizzly bears. And what's happening is the bears are coming down closer and closer to human buildings because of a plant called caraway. So caraway is a Eurasian plant that kind of looks like a parsnip or a white carrot, and it's super tasty. And so what happens is the bears come in fall, and they dig up that caraway, and it's full of starch, so it's going to help them get to bed and have all the energy that they need. So we did sampling in spring on the caraway, just to have a look at what is the caraway high in, and also what were the soil conditions that allowed it to expand, or where was it not doing very well. So we tested areas where we didn't find any caraway, and we tested where the caraway had lower bricks, or maybe you're seeing more insect attack, like, not the conditions for caraway, and then when caraway was really, really healthy. And what we found was that the soil conditions, what the caraway liked, were very bacterial soils that were low in boron. And if we had high boron and fungal dominated soils, we didn't see any caraway. So it gave those ranchers, it gives them some access in terms of, all right, what can I do to shift it away from bacterial dominance? And maybe I can put a little bit of boron on, or if they were going to herbicide, which I don't think they're going to, but just that insight in terms of can we shift those conditions so we're not bringing bears in. So I think it was interesting to see like other applications for these ideas.
And you mentioned earlier ventinata, a grass that's kind of encroaching in a lot of places. And I've seen other people who I appreciate their perspective say that it's one that we're going to hear a lot more about in the near future. Ariel Greenwood being one of those who I appreciate her perspective as somebody who's thinking through some of these things. And so what are some of the where is it now? Where is it headed? Is it something to be very concerned about? What are some of those ideas?
It's interesting to be in Montana where people are like, Venta, what? And when you're in Oregon, they're like, yeah, that's my grass. You know, like seeing in Oregon, like just huge swaths of ventinata and their how fluent they are around that grass, like knowing what an issue it is. So I think if you are in rangeland areas and you haven't seen it yet, train yourself to know what it looks like, because I think in some places in Montana it's been here for a while and people thought it was cheatgrass or Japanese brome, but it does look different, has a different seed head. It goes very red late in the season. So I think go and Google it if you haven't heard of it, and go and start to have a look. And we're seeing that it's even more aggressive than cheatgrass in terms of, we've managed to shift cheatgrass very quickly just through grazing management, whereas the ventinata is doing more like what the knapweed is in terms of very primitive soil conditions. I haven't seen the research on it about if it's feeding archaea, but I suspect that is what it's doing. So just keeping those soils really primitive. So yeah, what Ariel's doing is doing some trial work in terms of, well, if we bale graze on top of it, is that enough? Just adding in more complex foods like straw or hay, manure, urine, ripping it up with hooves. Because what we're seeing is it's not palatable at any time of the year, and livestock are just going around it and avoiding it. And so then you just end up with these soil systems that totally shut down. Yeah, unfortunately, it is in part that we have all across the world is these species that don't have their natural biocontrols, but in a bigger part really is that we are creating the conditions for them. If you've got bare ground, if you're overgrazing, you're setting the signal for these things to proliferate.
Are there some of these weeds, again in quotations, that we are shooting ourselves in the foot by running only one species? Is there an opportunity to bring in another species of livestock that can really do us some favors in those ways?
Totally. Yeah. And I think of some of the action and the different ways that some of these different species graze, or even, thinking of chickens or turkeys in terms of that disturbance, that scratching, that, getting into soils differently. But yeah, it's interesting when you look at a lot of the New Zealand context, we've often always run cattle and sheep together. That's just what we do. And they're to come here and go, well, here's a whole lot of species that we know that sheep and goats will certainly eat. And all you're running is cattle. And then, I don't know. It's that thing of like nature already has these answers for us. We just, need to be thinking more diversity. But you talk goats to most ranchers and they run screaming from the room. So, but, I think one of the best meat meals I ever had was goat. So, I'm all about eating goats.
I think we're going on 2 or 3 weeks drinking strictly goat milk at our house, and it's amazing. I mean, my theory, and I have nothing to back this up, my anecdotal research says that as long as you don't have a buck around, the goat milk is amazing. I think as soon as you bring a buck in, it tastes like a buck. But if you don't have a buck around, it tastes great to me. So
don't do that.
Yeah.
So. And I think, the more I've been to more places that are using range riding and shepherding, and I think perhaps there is that need to think about how do we return to some of the diversity of species, and how do we manage them. And the e-collars are out in America now, so I think they're only on cattle, but I wonder if we could put them on goats, because I know what it's like to manage goats. It's
Yeah. Yeah. And I do like to kind of hammer that idea of stacked enterprises, or at least not being, you don't have to be the one to run the goats if you can find somebody who's willing to bring them to you.
Yeah.
I think of the Permans in central South Dakota. They're bringing in outside sheep, and I think they come with a herder. And so they're doing the work, and it's not something that they've had to change a lot of things on their place, because the sheep graze enough differently from the cattle that they're able to run them through a lot of the same places the cows do. And it's still, it's just another income stream for them, and it's doing good things for their soil as well.
Yeah. Yeah. No. And I think we're bringing more young people onto the land too. And I think we need to be finding those opportunities, especially around succession. And I like what the James Ranch is doing, like in Colorado, figure out what different things you bring to the ranch and bring that back. You're not running cows.
What do you mean? Expound on that a little bit. Sorry.
Oh, so James Ranch, they had 5 children, and when they reached 18, they said, right, you've got to leave the ranch, go and get an education, and then figure out, if you did want to come back, what enterprise you could run. And so the first child that came back, I think, set up a dairy farm, which is still running cows, I guess, but producing milk. One of the other children, they were doing pigs. They started making cheese. They set up a restaurant. So one of the children came back and set up a restaurant. But just thinking of those stacking enterprises that could actually be complementary. Oh, yeah, and chickens. So running chickens. So every child had a freestanding enterprise that benefits the land and benefited the whole ranch. So the ranch is more successful as a whole. But I see a few people running that model, and I think it's a great idea.
And I think that one of the things that we've danced around a little bit, and just another anecdote from my own personal experience is, and again, this is back to that issue of who knows what you call a weed given your territory. It might be different somewhere else, but according to my NRCS guy, last year there was this patch of smartweed everywhere, or at least in this one spot where it's low, it's heavy clay soils. Last year we had, I think, 35 to 40 inches of rain where we usually get 15, and then this year, almost in that exact same spot, is all curly dock, and so there's that succession. I don't think I could find a smartweed plant, but it's all curly dock now. And then so I took a picture from next to a fence post, so I kind of have that reference point in which direction I was facing of that smartweed place. And now, or of the curly dock this year, and now next year, I'm kind of looking forward to see what's there. So I guess talk a little bit more about that succession and the process of those plants pulling things up out of the soil. What are some of those ideas? Yeah,
well, it's interesting because smartweed and dock I often think of as indicating similar things, which is, some people think of them as waterlogging, but actually it's surface crusting, so soils that are not necessarily breathing very well. And then smartweed doesn't have a root system that, say, a dock does. So if you again, digging up plants and looking at their roots is a great indicator in terms of what are they trying to do. Well, a dock is opening up and allowing more air movement and allowing that gas exchange and healing a soil if it's allowed to continue to go through that succession. Or if it's an area that's always going to be wet and boggy, then maybe it never goes past that successional point. But if we dig up those roots, we can have a look at what is it trying to perhaps do. Or if you think of reeds and rushes as well, if you dig them up, you'll see the soil's really orange around them, because what they're doing is they're pumping oxygen down their roots so that they don't rot basically in those wet conditions, and then you get those iron oxides forming. But they are actually healing soil, and if we allow that to continue to go through a phase, then where's it going to end? Is it only ever going to be a wetland, or is it going to start to become more like a sponge? I had a rancher contact me recently to complain that he's got these springs popping up on hillsides, and it's a pain because he's trying to move livestock around and he's got these springs. And I told him it's a first world problem and he should complain to somebody else. But what you see is a different, those springs then have different plant species that's more reflective of what they're doing. So you'll see reeds and rushes or even smartweeds on hillsides. It's not because necessarily it's waterlogged. It's that those soils aren't breathing. Go and have a look, dig it up, and just see, what is happening. But I love that you're observing that, Clay, and just kind of, because it's always in transition and in flux, and this could be something that is just a short term, like thinking of one thing that knapweed and foxtail barley both do is they are big pumps for mycorrhizal spores. So foxtail barley has a mycorrhizae that's adapted to live in sodic soils, and it's pumping all this mycorrhizae out there, which actually will be beneficial and then help that next successional wave of whatever's coming through. So we can allow them to obviously to go through that phase and just observe it and learn from it. But again, it depends on like how long is the successional wave, and
right.
Is it telling me that something's coming? I think for that sodic, seeing the foxtail barley where we're seeing sodic conditions, it's really telling you take action now. Don't mess about, because you could end up with soils that are, and it gets really challenging to heal. And we are healing sodic soils, but it's not a short process or a quick process.
Well, you just described my place. We moved on there in middle of October 2019, so a year ago. So I cabbed my dad's cows on one spot and fed hay there, where it was very, very degraded. And then I brought in some outside cattle to graze through the whole place, kind of one pass this year, and get some good manure distribution, animal impact on as many acres as possible in as short a time as possible to get some recovery going. And so, but other than that, it's been set, stocked, and hayed. That's the only management that's ever been on that place. So it's on top of all that, it's heavy clay soils. So there's silt loam ridges, but other than that, it's pretty much heavy clay soil. So we've got a long road ahead of us, but it's exciting to me because I get to watch and hopefully see management improving the landscape.
Yeah, and I think adding in those microbial foods, which is your manure and your straw and organic matter, and just kind of keep working on that. And then again, think of it as that healing crisis that you potentially are going to go through, because those heavy clays, you've got so much mineral in there that's often just bound up, and we start to open that up and release it. And you can get all sorts of really funky, weed plant species, but just to be like an open inquiry of watching that and not freaking out. And it's just, I think when we see systems kind of get stuck, when we are seeing more and more, why do I keep talking about thistles? I've been hanging out with people that have got thistles, so thistles keep coming to mind, but, like seeing more and more of that and less grass. But, cows will eat thistles, and cows will eat knapweed, and they will eat cheatgrass at certain times. But, so I think it's like, well, it's not a weed specifically for the cow, but what is it trying to tell us? How does that inform, is that impact of straw optimal, or actually did I put too much on and I've actually shut down that process by putting on too much material? Especially like some of these clay soils can be really high in potassium, and you're adding a whole lot of potassium. Then we could see some more of those broadleaf weed. I'm trying to think, like the ones that have got the burrs. There've been loads of them lately. My dog's been covered in them all underneath her armpit. But those type of species that have got a lot of those burrs, they can be telling us about an excess of potassium. And then if we keep putting on hay, we can keep increasing that, which is why you want to, do your leaf tissue test and your plant or your soil test, and just go, okay, what is it that would suit this landscape to rehabilitate?
Well, I'd like to move in, if you got some time, I'd like to move into some questions from the private Facebook group. And I guess the one I'll start with is, I think this is a fellow Kiwi. Is there a way to farm with zero inputs, or another way to say it, are we at the mercy of inputs being either conventional or biodynamic forever?
Biodynamic forever. That's interesting. No, I don't. I definitely don't think we're going to be at the mercy of inputs forever. Many operators I work with, I guess, are once you address some of these catalysts or what I call the enabling factors, like if it is a trace element issue, then that system starts to rehabilitate. I guess you got to think about input seeds as well. Seeing people do some incredible stuff with soil rehabilitation using, cover crops. But if you get your grazing optimal and the trace elements are functional and that system is humming now, then you're going to keep building soil. It's not like if you look at a teaspoon of soil and hold it in your hand, what you're looking at are minerals that are not in a plant available form. We're never going to run out of minerals because that mineralization process happens deeper in the soil. So you get microbiology and worms and ants and all of that mixing those layers and bringing that material up and making it bioavailable. We're never going to run out of minerals. I mean, that whole thing is such a conventional, well, it's a great way to sell product, I guess. But my definite view is that, no, we're not going to continue to have to put inputs into the system. But you've got to also recognize that there's times when things happen that maybe aren't optimal. You put down your hay and you've got all this bedding and then you get a 10-inch rainfall, which I've seen people have, and you can make an awful big mess. And how long is it going to take to recover? I mean, some of these soils are recovering within a year, and some of them we can still see it 20 years later. That was the rainfall event from 1880, So, yeah, I think it's always a case-by-case basis, and we don't have to shut the door. Like, we don't have to be – what I get concerned about is people get really dogmatic. You can only graze, or you can only do cover crops, or you must never. And it's like, well, who says? There's no reason why 20 years down the track you don't go, well – actually, I could do with a little bit of phosphate or whatever it is. Like, no one's has to be stuck. But, yeah, I do believe that we can totally close the loops. But I also think there's a lot that we can make on ranch or on farm with materials that we're already growing. So, doing compost or vermicast or, those kind of extracts. We can have that all within the boundaries of the ranch. We don't need to be bringing in external inputs.
And some of these I think we've covered, but I don't want to assume that there isn't more to say about them, obviously. So the next one I've got is how do I identify what targeted amendment, man? How do I identify what targeted amendment to use based on the weeds that are established? Yeah,
so that's where your soil and leaf tissue tests would be informative. And so... yeah, what we're finding with these chelated trace elements is we're only putting on and I don't know I'm sorry, you guys need to catch up with metric. What is this thing? I have no idea what it is. And I keep trying to figure it out. But anyway, we're putting on probably a teaspoon of actual trace element per acre. So just these incredibly chelated forms based on what we're seeing the plant doing. So let's say it is very high in boron. We're going to put this tiny amount of boron back on, and it is almost like homeopathics. So we're talking parts per billion, I guess, of application. And what I'm seeing more and more is that we need less, not more. We need the biological system, the plant systems are so sensitive. It's us that's running around with hammers everywhere, and it's like the plant just needs this little tickle and it will respond. So with the different amendments, I just think less is more.
And are those foliar applications, or how is that being applied?
Yeah, well, I hope you've got ground cover all year round. So it's going to go on as a foliar. If people were drilling seed, then we're going to put stuff in the seed box, biologicals or vermicast or some kind of biostimulants that could go down with the seed. If you are doing a pass at all. Otherwise, foliars, and we're doing what we call the slurry sprays. So it means that we're putting something like vermicast or compost out as a slurry with your trace elements. It's got all the biology in it, and it works as these quorum signals. So these chemical microbial signals. So you don't need a lot. We're doing 2 pounds of vermicast per acre, tiny amounts. Yeah.
And is there an optimal time of year to apply compost tea? Would a deep frost line negatively impact fall applied vermicast or compost tea? This is from Minnesota, so that's a little bit of a context.
Yeah. I think if you're doing fall application, you really want to be applying when the plants are active. So there's no point really applying stuff when you're in dormancy, unless you're trying to put stuff on like what we call the hygiene cleanups. So biological or mineral stimulants that are going to help to break down, let's say, thatch or litter or stubble. That will actually keep working away. Even under the snow, it's amazing what life you'll see still humming under the snowpack. So I don't think it's a total waste trying to put compost teas down in fall when it gets really cold. So again, it's like thinking about your cover crops. What is your goal with this particular application? And so the humification process happens over winter, and the mineralization process happens in the growing season. So if we're putting teas or extracts down, then we're helping to stimulate that humification process.
How do you remove poisonous weeds throughout pastures without herbicide control?
I guess it depends. Like, it's so interesting to me. We were testing death camas recently, watching the cows in the fields, and those cows were not eating any of the death camas. I mean, this field was so thick with it. It was super interesting to look at it nutritionally. Like, it was, if they could eat it, it was incredibly nutritional, but they knew not to eat it. But I think the poisonous weeds is the same way as other things. Figure out what it's trying to tell you, and then address that underlying issue. Yeah, and you know, I guess it depends if it's larkspur or something that animals, or like hoary cress, if animals are actually eating it, then sure, that might be where you want to get a bit more aggressive. But I do find animals are smarter than us a lot of the time.
Yeah, no doubt. I was at a, well, when I, way back to the start of the podcast, I guess I was in the High Plains Ranch Practicum, and we went and toured this ranch, and he had moved from March calving to May and June calving, and he, being the young zealot I was at that time, I was looking around. I'm like, well, wouldn't he have been better off to, cull the herd and buy May and June calving cows, because his March cows were worth more than the May and June calving cows, and he's the instructor said, nope, you don't necessarily need to ask him that question. I can tell you what the answer is. It's these cows know not to eat larkspur, and bringing in outside cattle that don't would have been a disaster. So
very good.
Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah.
I wonder though, like, how many you could keep of the herd? Like, would it be 50% would be enough to train the next generation?
Right.
We see some training. I saw that, I was talking to Alejandro Carrillo down in Mexico, and how he brought in just a few bulls that knew about eating prickly pear. And he said within 6 months, the whole herd's eating prickly pear. So like, how many is it that influences behavior? I don't know. Interesting. I'm sure Provenza probably knows the answer.
Do you recommend shredding if goat weed or other is very thick? And I'm not sure if this is the same as going in and cutting. Like my dad bought a hayfield that was pretty much solid thistle, and he just cut it 3 times in 1 year and reduced it drastically the next year. So is that a practice you're a fan of, or is shredding referring to something else?
So goat weed is, I have to make sure we're talking about the same thing. That's like a shrub.
I don't have any further context. I know I'm thinking this is this young lady is from Texas, but I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, I think when we're talking about some of the shrubs,
shredding, that would make sense. then yes, just there's so many different common names. Right. I saw a cool thing. My father actually had it was a drone shredder. This thing was huge, this huge machine that was just without a driver in it, off the side of these really steep hillsides to shred gorse, which is an invasive New Zealand plant that's covered in big prickles, and we had woolly nightshade.
toxic plants, big plants. And it was incredible just to see it all get shredded up. And then as long as you listen to what that plant was trying to tell you, which is these very fungal dominated soils, very sleepy, and then you go to action and you're going to impact on that. So you're going to, and you could even hook this up if you had the shredder, of like spraying molasses at the same time. So if we are dealing with these woody weeds, molasses is going to help to stimulate the bacteria, help to break down that material and just speed up the decomposition, but also change the germination signal. So we could use a bit of molasses. If it's a trace element, again, add that in. But if you're going to be out there with a piece of equipment, can you rig something up so you can be putting beneficial stuff down at the same time? But I mean, I've seen areas where people have mechanically kind of ripped up sage or even, fire management of some of these landscapes, and you can see what benefit that is. And if you think, a lot of these landscapes, no one wants to talk about fire, but, fire was a big part of how these landscapes were managed and built. And so I'm not against things like that occasionally, not the once a year burn that seems to be common in some areas, but, once every 10 years to just, revitalize an area. I don't have a problem with that.
If you have a invasion of a species, say leafy spurge, ventonata, cheatgrass, something like that, is there ever a herbicide solution, or is there always a grazing solution or something else that you would go with first, and then maybe next year, if that didn't work or if it gets worse, we try something else?
Yeah, I would look to grazing first. I mean, I think grazing is always your number one tool for everything that we talk about. And the grazing is why you have those weeds, because you haven't been doing what your landscape's requiring you to do, which is probably overgrazing in areas, or pasture sizes are too large, you're set stocking, you're putting animals out in the field at the same time of the year, you're calving in the same area every time of the year, just that kind of lack of adaptiveness or flexibility, and so the weeds are here to give you a good slap around the chops and go, hey, wake up, you can't keep doing that. And so herbicide would always be my last tool.
And you earlier were wanting to pull back a little bit on the word attack. I want to give you freedom to say whatever you would like to say about the language that we use when we start to talk about approaches to management.
Yeah, well, I think it just speaks back into these paradigms, isn't it? And generative agriculture is a total shift in how we see and observe and interact and think about landscapes. And I think the old command and control and attack and dominate and kill is the old paradigm. And we step into, all right, how do I align myself with nature? How do I observe? How do I work with? She's a lot smarter than any of us. So listening to those keys and responding to, as opposed to reacting, that whole knee-jerk stuff, like it sometimes when I'm working with conventional cropping, it feels like every day they're at war. I'm like, oh, that's tiring. Like, where's the joy in that? Yeah. And so I think, and we're seeing some exciting stuff happening. I think we're getting closer to organic no-till, which I had an organic professor tell me about 20 years ago that anyone that said that was a liar and it's not possible, and we're starting to see some really, really neat stuff in the cropping with intercropping and crimping crops. And I think we still got a way to go, but we're getting closer. So let's bring on the innovation and trying to figure out how do we do this without the use of harsh chemicals.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, that's a topic on the list of things that I'd like to explore a little bit farther, the idea of no-kill farming. So yeah. That's something that's interesting to me. Last one is, what about some tools to find info on indicator species appropriate to your region or context? Are there good resources out there that you can recommend?
My book.
Yeah, perfect.
And When Weeds Talk by Jay McCaman. This is one that I think everybody should have in their reading list. It breaks weeds down in terms of their major minerals, trace elements, and soil conditions. It's made for an American audience. So yeah, people maybe are listening from other places in the world. You need to do your own leaf tissue testing and build your own observations. And a lot of these weeds are common around the world. Then Charles Walter's books, Weeds Control Without Poisons, is a really good one. But I think we are all building our own, I guess, repertoire in terms of trying to figure out what is it that these different species are doing in different contexts. So what might be happening in California doesn't necessarily apply in Vermont. So yeah, this is very much citizen science stuff.
Sure. And it is kind of back to something Alan Williams said when he was on the podcast, and an article I think he ended up publishing is all research is ultimately anecdotal. That, you know, you've got that N equals 1 experiment is kind of the what you've got to work with as far as what works on your place.
Yeah.
And what works in different areas of your place. I mean, I can almost point to a line in the carpet on my place where we change from heavy clay to silt loam, you know, as you start to work up. So it just changes that quickly. Yes.
So I encourage people to get a shovel, dig holes, look at plant root systems, look at where they're growing, think about what happened here in the past, think about, difference in management, doing the testing, but it's really about bringing all those observations together is where the key is in terms of what are these species trying to tell you, and just keep building up your knowledge bank.
Perfect. After they've bought your book, read it, listened to it, where can they go to find out more about where you'll be? Are you finding ways to continue to gather people in groups and talk about these things?
Yeah, not so much. I had 46 full-day workshops cancelled, so that was a bit of a shock to the system. So instead, I've taken the training online. So the first course is being released this Sunday, but it's only available for 4 days because we're going to do an intensive. So by the time you release this, it might already be gone, but it will be back out in a few months' time. And so that is the beginning observation school in terms of how do I measure things and what is it trying to tell me. So I'm excited about that school, and we will have another 3 out next year, by the way I'm going. So taking learning online, but the idea with these courses is that it's really practical, so you've got to go out in the field and do those do those practical things yourself.
Very good. Yeah, this is currently the idea was to release this October 12th, so in a couple of months from then people could track down that course.
Yes.
And is that all on the Integrity Soils website as far as those opportunities?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So we'll have links to that in the show notes page, workingcows.net/159. People can go there, check it out, buy your book, buy a book to share with a friend, all those things. So
we like it. And on audio so they can practice their New Zealand accent.
Yes, perfect. Yeah, there's so many things that sounds so much better when a New Zealander says it. So
I'll take that. I think
all right.
Anyway. So lovely to talk to you as always.
Yep. Thank you for your time.
All right. Thanks, Clay.
Nicole is obviously a wealth of information. Really appreciate her joining me today. Had an opportunity after the recording with her to talk a little bit about the imposter syndrome. And so that's going to be in the bonus episodes available through Patreon, patreon.com/workingcows. You can find those bonus episodes and you can join up as a patron. A couple of changes in Patreon is you can now give a year at a time. So I know a lot of ranchers have kind of spurts of income that come in big lumps throughout the year. So maybe once a year is better for you. You can join for a year at a time at patreon.com/workingcows. Really excited to talk to Steve Campbell next week on the Working Cows podcast. We're going to talk about what is the form of a good cow. So really looking forward to that. I hope you will join us for episode 160 of the Working Cows podcast coming your way real soon.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.